Welcome to the Books of Titans podcast hosted by Eric Rostad. Join him on his 15-year journey through the immortal books. He'll share what he's learning, explore profound ideas across time and cultures, and share the one thing he always hopes to remember from each immortal book.
Today I'm going to cover the comedy play The Frogs by Aristophanes. This play is contained in book 17 for my 2025 reading list. Well, if you listened to the episode last week, I covered Aristophanes' The Clouds, and you would have heard that I was not a big fan of that play or the comedies so far. And I've read 5 comedies so far now, the Frogs being the 5th one. But the first 4, The Birds, Lysistrata, The Women of the Assembly, and then The Clouds, I was not a big fan. I thought after coming off the tragedies where it's kind of these grand myths, these grand stories and deep questions and just, high drama, coming to these plays about farts and other body parts and that kind of thing, it took me a while to get into it. And so I was not a big fan of those first 4 that I read, but then I got to The Frogs here and it changed everything. I really enjoyed this one. So I'm looking forward to talking about this one today. So at first I had planned to read all 11 of the surviving plays by Aristophanes, but after I didn't like the first 4, I said, I'm just going to read one more and then move on to Thucydides. Well, I had continually seen references to this play, The Frogs, in my reading of the tragedy plays, because in this play, Aristophanes has Aeschylus and Euripides, the two of the 3 main Greek tragedy writers. He has them battle each other in Hades, and it's a verbal battle. They're trying to determine who was the best tragic poet, and so there's almost like this battle that takes place in Hades as they talk about their works and compare them. And so I was eager to read this one. And I just kept seeing certain quotes over and over that came from this work. And so I was looking forward to reading this one. And so I wanted to close off with this one. And instead of reading all 11, I would just read 5. So I picked up the Penguin Classics edition that was translated by David Barrett, and I absolutely loved this one, The Frogs. It lacked a lot of that crudeness and the things that I didn't like about the first 4 that I read. And then just that scene of Aeschylus and Euripides battling each other and contrasting their styles was so cool, especially just after having come off reading all of the tragedy plays. So I know this is a comedic take on their style, but there was a lot of truth in what was said and just some incredible food for thought within that. So remember that these comedies were performed at the city Dionysus, and this was a festival that would have taken place early in the spring in Athens, Greece, and the theater was actually right on the slope of the hill where the famous Acropolis is, and so there would have been this multi-day festival. But it was honoring the god Dionysus, or the other name for that god is Bacchus. So this is the god of wine, theater, fertility, and festivity. And so this play, The Frogs, actually starts off with a discussion between Dionysus and his slave Xanthias. And all of a sudden, Dionysus has this sudden urge to meet Euripides. But this play is taking place in 405 BC, and Euripides has just passed away in 406 BC. So to get to Euripides, for Dionysus to be able to talk to Euripides, he's going to have to go to Hades. And so both Aeschylus and Euripides are deceased at this point. Aeschylus would have passed away many years prior. But in 405 BC here, both of them have passed. So Dionysus and Xanthias in this play, they stop by Heracles' house to ask him how to get to Hades and what to do once you get there, because one of the labors that Heracles had was to go down to Hades and to kill Cerberus, the dog. And so he has experience there. So they go to Heracles' house and they ask him all about this. And again, this is a comedy, so there's just a lot of humor amidst all of this that's going on. So then they go down to Hades, and the first one really funny part here is Dionysus asks Charon, he asks him, "Can I go to hell?" And Charon replies, and he says, "You can, as far as I'm concerned." And Dionysus says, "Oh, splendid. 2, please." And Charon says, "Sorry, sir, no slaves allowed, not unless they fought in the sea battle." And so Dionysus is able to go on the boat to get to Hades, and then they make Xanthias, the slave, walk around the water to get to the same place. And while they're in the boat going over towards Hades, this is when the frogs appear, and the frogs are in the water, and they are the chorus, and they start singing songs while they're on the way. And so I wanted to read one of these songs, and it starts off with frog noises like brekeke, kex, coax, quax, and then it goes into these words. Oh, we are the musical frogs. We live in the marshes and bogs. Sweet is the hymn that we sing as we swim, and our voices are known for their beautiful tone. When on festival days we sing to the praise of the genial God, and we don't think it odd when the worshiping throng to the sound of our song. And then their song keeps going on, but that's where we get the name of the frogs, is the chorus here of the frogs in the water on the way to Hades. So Dionysus ends up getting to Hades, and then there's this contest that's set up to determine who is the best tragic poet. And so we have Aeschylus versus Euripides, and it's just this epic. On Twitter the other day, I said it's like a rap battle, a modern day rap battle where they're just going back and forth. And so here's one line from Aeschylus, where he says, well, you see, my works happen to have outlived me, so I don't have them down here with me. And then he says of Euripides, his died with him, but never mind. Let's have a match by all means if you think that's a good idea. So right away, Aeschylus says, my works live on. There's, people are still talking about them, and Euripides, just having passed the year before, they don't know if his will live on. And Aeschylus says his died with him. Euripides, a few pages later, he says this. What I did was to teach the audience to use its brains, introduce a bit of logic into the drama. The public have learnt from me how to think, how to run their own households, to ask, why is this so? What do we mean by that? And I'll end the quote there, but it's just kind of a funny going back and forth. Aeschylus is kind of known as the traditional poet. His language has that gravitas. Euripides was kind of known for introducing new ideas. And so they're just kind of going back and forth talking about their works and different aspects of the work. They talk a lot about the technical merits of the work, and very little about the moral value. And in the introduction of this book, which is also done by David Barrett, he says that to judge a work on its technical merits and not on its moral value is absurd. And so that's part of what's going on here. Is just there's absurdity in it. There's humor in it. But Aeschylus and Euripides are going back and forth. They bring up Homer at one point, and they say this: and why is Homer himself held in such high esteem, if not for the valuable military instruction embodied in his work? Organization, training, equipment, it's all there. And end quote there. And that's Aeschylus talking. And I just thought it was funny that he asks why Homer was held in such high esteem, if not for the valuable military instruction embodied in his work. When I think of Homer, that's not the first thing that comes to mind, the military instruction, but it was kind of a funny thing to say. But then Aeschylus later on, he says this, and you can see the imprint of Homer on my own work clearly enough, end quote. So there's obvious respect there for Homer. Towards the very end, Aeschylus says this: there is more than one kind of flower in the garden of the Muses. And just talking about all the different ways that the Muses, there's song, there's poems, there's poetry, there's these different Muses to more than one kind of flower in the garden of the Muses. I loved that idea. So for all of the tragedy plays, and then I covered this last week in the first comedy that I covered, there's certain things that are found in each of these plays and things I like to keep in mind as I'm reading them. And so the first is just the location. Where does this take place? In this comedy play takes place, it starts at the outskirts of Athens, and then it ends up in Hades. The first speaker is Xanthias. That's the slave who is with Dionysus. And that's just an interesting choice as well. Some of the tragedies would start out with a god speaking. Others would be a person. Interesting that the slave has the first word here, but it is it's not as much a prologue as just an immediate conversation, discussion between Dionysus and Xanthias. And then the chorus, there's a chorus at the beginning of initiates, and these are initiates of the mysteries, and that was closely tied with Dionysus. But then the chorus shifts to the frogs, and so you just think of this being performed in the theater. Like you would have had this group of probably 20 or so members of the chorus. The chorus in a comedy it was larger than it would be in a tragedy. And so you just picture these people dressed up as frogs and singing, and it must have been quite the spectacle. This play, when it was performed, it won first place. Again, these plays would have been in competition with one another. So you had 3 tragedy plays performed and then a satyr play, and then comedies were performed after all of that. And so the comedies would have been they would have been performed against one another, and so this one won first place. We learned last week that Clouds won, it was either second or third place, I think, but you wanted to win first place, so it was a big deal if you didn't win it, and obviously a big deal if you did. As I mentioned, I read the Penguin's Classic version of this in translation by David Barrett. I purchased this book around Christmas time last year at the Strand in New York. That was my first time going there. And they had, I wanted to get all of the Aristophanes comedy plays. And so they had a lot of these old Penguin editions there. So I bought about 3 or 4 Aristophanes books there that had some of these different plays. So it's fun. I mentioned that just because I have the Strand bookmark in the book here, and I really enjoyed being at that bookstore. So this episode will have 2 more segments. In the next segment, I'll cover what I learned about comedy. So I'm going to kind of step away from the frogs. I'll talk a little bit about it, but talk about comedy more in general and address some of the things that startled me about comedy in last week's episode, and then just in general. But things I learned about comedy from this play and then from the introduction of this play. And then in segment 3, I will cover the one thing, my main takeaway from The Frogs by Aristophanes. So one of my favorite things about reading is this aspect of coming across things that I don't understand or I have questions about. And so I just kind of pack those questions away. A lot of times I'll write them down, or they just kind of live in my head of, I wonder about this. And so it's so fun to then come across the answer shortly after in another book. And so it's truly, that's one of my biggest delights in reading is that kind of question and answer thing. But the questions coming in one book and then the answers coming in another, and they're just kind of being this thing that ties them all together. So I want to cover some of those things in this segment here. And the first is in last week, I mentioned that in the Clouds, that Aristophanes just lets Socrates have it. And so that's part of comedy. There's this roasting element of it where the people would have been in the crowd, most of them in the audience, and Aristophanes through this play is just roasting them. And it's disturbing. I mean, I've seen modern day roasts, and I would hate to be on the receiving end of that. Like that would be one of my worst nightmares. And so even reading somebody getting roasted is, it just disturbs me. I don't like it. But here it is in these plays, and it might be a politician, it might be someone who's ugly, who's known in the town, and so there's humorous aspects of it, and it's endearing in the sense of like Athens is small enough to where people would have known these people. It's kind of like the celebrities of the time, and this guy's just roasting them. But there's a particular just nasty roast about Socrates in The Clouds, and he even brings up the idea of corrupting the youth. And 24 years later, Socrates is killed. He's sentenced to death, and you just kind of wonder, like, was part of that path from The Clouds in by Aristophanes? Did that kind of set something in motion that ended up with the sentence of death for Socrates? And so I wondered that. And then I also wondered, was Socrates there? And from what I was able to gather, Socrates would have been in attendance when The Clouds was performed, but we don't have his response. We don't know if he was just, hurt by it or disgusted or if he was angry. Like we don't know the response. But there is a work, Plato's Symposium, and it is discussed here in the introduction to this book. And so let me read this section. In the Symposium, then, he is presented as a well-liked and convivial person. And so the he here would have been Aristophanes, who divides his time, as Socrates remarks, between Aphrodite and Dionysus. He appears to be on good terms with his host Agathon and with the other guests, including Socrates, whom he had ridiculed so mercilessly in the clouds 7 years earlier. End quote. I butchered some of the words in there, but the idea there is that Socrates and him are on good terms. So that just kind of calmed my soul. I guess I wasn't as worried, some spat 2,500 years ago, but Socrates and Aristophanes, even after that play, were on good terms according to Plato's Symposium. So we're good there. We're in the clear. Now, a few things about comedy. So here's this is part of the actual play here, The Frogs, this thing, and this comes from the women's leader of the chorus, and she says this: "We've no use for bounders who don't understand the traditions of comedy, noble and grand, who snigger and leer till the festival's ended, and find dirty meanings where none are intended." And the quote there. Again, last week I talked a lot about fraternity like content and like the lowest denominator of comedy and is in a lot of these plays, and coming off the tragedies and these lofty ideals and after Homer and all that, to come to these comedies, it just struck me as off-putting at first. But here, who snigger and leer till the festival's ended and find dirty meanings where none are intended. It was kind of a funny portrayal there, but here's a few other things that came up in the introduction about comedy. And so here's the first one. Comedy was not expected to tell a story as tragedy was, and that the songs, dances, and costumes of the comic chorus were regarded as an essential part of the entertainment. End quote. David Barrett, who does the introduction here, he talks a lot about the costumes and how important those were to especially to the comedies. And so it was interesting there just to see comedy. You're not expected to tell a story in comedy as you were in tragedy. And that's one thing I picked up on right away. One thing I didn't like, but that's just an expectation that I should have going into these comedies. It's not going to be like tragedies. Another part here of the introduction. It was also possible for a poet to presuppose in his audience an enthusiasm for contemporary drama and even a considerable knowledge of the works of the great Athenian tragedians. End quote. I love that. Just and that's obvious in the tragedy plays. Like you just would have had to have known, and the audience would have known a lot about the myths that were being referenced. There's a lot of things referenced in these comedy plays, and I'm thankful to the notes in these editions where they'll talk about somebody that Aristophanes is mocking or something like that, and it just kind of gives you an idea. Another thing that came up in the reading of the Frogs, I noticed that at times there would be a fourth person speaking. And if you remember kind of as we went through the tragedies, Aeschylus would have two actors, and then Sophocles was credited with introducing the third actor. And what that means is that at any given time, you would have three people out there. You'd have a chorus as well, but three actors out there at any given time. But you would have multiple people in a play. And so how would you do that? If there's 8 people in the play, that means that these 3 people have to be all of those people. And so they would have masks and different costumes that would designate them as different people. So most of the plays would have a protagonist who would be out there most of the time or the entire time. And so that protagonist actor would usually just be one person. The second actor might be a few people, and then the third actor would play more parts. But when you're reading these plays, you just know at any given time, there can only be 3 people out there. And this is what is said in the introduction here. The rule or convention of employing only 3 actors, very understandable if, as is possible, all the speaking actors were paid by the state, and also as a method of ensuring that poets competed on equal terms, had its effect on the structure both of tragedy and of comedy. Occasionally, a comic poet was allowed a 4th actor, but only for very small parts which would not affect the structure of the play as a whole. End quote. And then later on, it says this: readers may find it amusing to work out the casting of the frogs for themselves. The 4th actor appears twice. End quote. And so I noticed that, and I just kind of was wondering as I was reading, could comedy have more actors? And so I went back and read the introduction afterwards, and then found out that yes, indeed, at least for the frogs, there are 4 actors here, but it was not a common occurrence. So with that, comedy kind of maintained a lot of the structure settings for tragedy, but within a comedic element. So I found that to be really, really interesting. The last thing I want to mention is something I brought up last week, and that is just freedom of speech. I was shocked at the level of freedom of speech by Aristophanes in what he said about others, what he said about Athens as a whole, and it was actually quite startling. But there were limits to that, and so I want to read a few parts here on freedom of speech. And again, this is from the overall introduction to this work. The comic poets enjoyed very considerable freedom of speech, and a person mocked or attacked in a comedy had no legal means of redress, though the gentleman referred to in the Frogs seems to have had his revenge by proposing a cut in the poet's emoluments. But here's what was forbidden. But impiety was forbidden and could be severely punished. The comedies thus give us an idea of what was regarded as impious and what was not. They provide a valuable sidelight on the attitude of the Greeks to religion at this period, end quote. And then he gives a little some examples. For instance, he says, there is no mockery of the mysteries themselves. Deeper levels of religious experiment that again, you didn't touch on some of these things. You could make fun of some of the gods like Hermes, Poseidon, Dionysus, and Heracles, but you really couldn't touch Apollo or Zeus. You could do a few things with them, but you had to be very careful. And Aristophanes actually got arrested for mocking one thing, and it was for impiety. So, he got off on that charge, but there were limits. So it wasn't just an absolute free for all. You still had to honor some of the gods at least. But I was very surprised just in general at the level of freedom of speech otherwise. So, that's going to do it for these themes and these things that stuck out in the Frogs and comedy in general. In the next segment, I'll cover my one thing. All right, my one thing deals with a subject brought up where Euripides and Aeschylus are going back and forth in Hades towards the end of this play. And Euripides was known to have introduced new ideas and new ways of thinking in his plays, and Aeschylus was the traditionalist. And so they're talking about this aspect of it, in that Euripides would introduce things kind of like the comedies where it's not proper or it's not noble themes and that kind of thing. And I just found this back and forth to be interesting. So Aeschylus is bringing up one of Euripides' plays that was shocking, and Euripides says, but I didn't invent the story. And then Aeschylus says, no, such things do happen, but the poet should keep quiet about them, not put them on stage for everyone to copy. Schoolboys have a master to teach them. Grown-ups have the poets. We have a duty to see that what we teach them is right and proper. And Euripides responds, and you think that the right and proper way to teach them is to write your kind of high-flown Olympian language instead of talking like a human being? And Aeschylus says, my poor dear fellow, noble themes and noble sentiments must be couched in suitably dignified language, end quote. I agree with Aeschylus there, and Aeschylus does end up winning this epic battle of who is the best Greek poet, at least in the Frogs here by Aristophanes. Dionysus does want to take Aeschylus back up to the real world to have him return, but when I read that, I agree with that, and I think that's part of what was shocking about comedies when I first started reading them. I like thinking of these noble themes and noble sentiments being couched in suitably dignified language and suitably dignified presentations. And I think that's one thing that just shocked me at first about the comedies. But fear not, I am coming around. I've enjoyed the frogs here, and I almost wonder if I stopped reading these too soon, if I should read the others, because I've already gotten back into Thucydides here. But we'll see. Maybe later this year, if I have some additional time, I'll go back to some of these other plays by Aristophanes, because there is another one where Euripides shows up, and I like that aspect of it. But yeah, that's just my one thing. Just this presentation of noble themes, and Aeschylus kind of hits on that. But it's funny that it takes place in a comedy, and it's kind of the question I had last week, or the thought that I had. So I love that Aristophanes addresses it through Euripides and Aeschylus talking to each other, but just kind of a brilliant way to discuss that. Well, in conclusion here, this is, in the introduction, they called it escape literature, and it allows you to be into this safe, neutral world of literary criticism. So Aeschylus and Euripides are going back and forth about how they wrote their plays and what they put in their plays. So far, this is my favorite play by Aristophanes that I've read so far. And I just loved that fictional dialogue between Aeschylus and Euripides. I thought that was so cool. And it's one of those things that ties the great books together, that things are referencing one another. So obviously in the tragedies, you have so many references back to Homer, back to the Greek myths. And then in these comedies here, you have so many references to the tragedy plays and what was in them and what was discussed, how the playwrights themselves did things. And I love that, because it just builds on each other. It kind of makes, when I was reading it, I was thinking, oh yeah, that is, or was that how Aeschylus presented things? Or was that how Euripides presented his plays? And it just kind of makes you think deeper about the plays themselves, the tragedy plays, but within a comedy that was written not too long after a lot of these tragedy plays. I mean, just a few years. So I loved that aspect of it. Yeah, I need to go back and read a few more of these comedies. I did find it so interesting too that the comedies was kind of commenting upon itself, and some of the objections I had last week were addressed, but within the comedy. So that was a neat thing. Well, that's going to do it for this episode. Thank you for listening. I'd love to hear from you if you've read The Frogs, if you've read Aristophanes, if you have any suggestions on, I told you which ones I've read. If there's any that you think are must reads by Aristophanes, let me know. I've got the books. I just have moved on to Thucydides at the moment. So I'm going to read Anabasis and then The Education of Cyrus by Xenophon. That I'm hoping to finish those by the end of June here. And then July, I go into my summer break month. So I have a month just where I read books that have kind of piled up on the to be read list. So these are, I take a break from the immortal books and then read some of these books. And then in August, I'll get back into the immortal books again. You can follow Books of Titans on Instagram or Twitter, and then the website. I just have a ton of different resources and reading lists and all sorts of fun stuff there. So be sure to check that out. I'll be back next week, and we'll either discuss another comedy play or maybe even Thucydides, more likely a comedy play, just because that Thucydides book is going to take me a while to read. Until then, keep reading, keep learning, and keep listening. I'm out.